So last week we talked about how miserable everything is. So this week we're going to talk about what to do about it. Yeah. This is actually something I've been wanting to talk about for a long time, and I never really expected faith and fear to go hand in hand. It's kind of surprising to me. That being said, a long time ago, I read this book, which is called Fear and Trembling by Kierkegaard, which is a great book. So it's possible unconsciously I remembered that association. I don't know. Yeah. And so hopefully what I want to do tonight is argue what constitutes faith under this new sort of disposition we're trying to take up as like defining the Christian as the one who worships truth and having a scientific disposition and all those sorts of things. So that we can dissolve this old stupid idea that it's basically grounded in the blindness. Because I would say that the idea of faith is probably one of the most problematic ideas connected to religion these days, given how secular everything is. So hopefully we can ground it in something a little bit more rigorous so that people that are kind of stupid will be satisfied with the answer. So I really think that this is a great opening, and I love this painting. It made me think of this painting that you sent me. I think it's a really great painting because, first let me just read Psalm 23 because it's beautiful. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He maketh me to lie down in green pastures. He leadeth me beside the still waters. He restoreth my soul. He leadeth me in the paths of righteousness for his name's sake. Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for thou art with me. Thy rod and thy staff, they comfort me. Thou preparest a table before me in the presence of mine enemies. Thou anointest my head with oil. My cup runneth over. Surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life, and I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever. I wanted to open with this because the way that this always strikes me is as though David is taking up an oath before God to, I suppose, the sort of purpose that that he sees that God has imposed upon him. Sort of how I imagine this is that David is intuiting the totality of what God needs from him, and in that, it's in the name of that thing that caused him to write this psalm. And I think that this picture of the knight praying before battle is a very appropriate image, I think, that parallels this idea. Yeah, so this is sort of the spirit that I want to take up in tonight. This is like what I think faith is. And I think there's going to be some evidence that I'll point to try and suggest that that's true. So before we get there, though, I just want to remind us of what fear constitutes. And this is the goddess in Hindu of destruction. I think her name is Kali. I'm not an expert on this. I just know that she's the typical image that shows up when one is searching for archetypal deities that correspond to the feminine destructive nature. And in this story, she incurs some kind of horrible wrath and like kills a bunch of guys and starts cutting their heads off or something. I don't remember. But I really like the image, regardless of the tale. I know that it corresponds to this negative feminine because I've read it in books that do analysis on the negative feminine. But I do like this image, right? She has severed heads and cut hands and multiple arms. She's carrying swords. She's standing on conquered, vanquished foes. She has this like red, devilish fire symbolism. Like her tongue is out as though she's devouring. And incidentally, there's a lot of the image of the negative feminine also appears in it's either in Mayan or Incan symbolism, and there too, when the negative feminine is indicated, her tongue is sticking out. And I think that it's to indicate the devouring nature of the negative feminine. And it's like this circular structure which characterizes the negative feminine. It's like anything that has substance and the underlying chaos, which this underlying chaos is supposed to be the negative feminine symbolism. The substance is corresponding to the positive feminine, and it just goes like this. And the nature of this thing is to sort of subsume all of this back into itself. It's like to level everything back into a primordial structure so that something new can be reborn, or something new can be born. Yeah. And this same structure emerges in alchemy too. And again, this corresponds to the emergence of the state of the Negretto, in which you dissolve everything at the beginning. So you begin with, like, sometimes it's literal fecal matter, but you begin with shit, basically, and you put that into, like, a retort and send it into its blackened state, and then you can start doing work on it. Yeah, and so, of course, this dissolution means the dissolution of substance as such. And so, again, that is why it corresponds to an existential rather than personal fear, because it's actually indicating an archetypal process, a fundamental process, whereby we begin the process of transformation. And so it necessarily begins with, being thrown into a state where the only answer you have is, I'm in horrible pain and I don't know where to go. Yeah, Neumann actually gives I think that Neumann gives a good account of this when he says the emergence of this negative feminine deity comes as a consequence of one trying to give birth to new consciousness, trying to build something out of sort of the it's the process of trying to separate oneself from the mother, where the mother is basically the totality of your experience, right? And so there needs to be the development of conflict in order to create a polarizing energy, in order to separate oneself. So he says the youth struggling for self-consciousness now begins, insofar as he is an individual, to have a personal fate. And for him, the great mother becomes the deadly and unfaithful mother, because she threatens to consume the structure he's trying to build. Right. Yeah. And so I say here, the process of realizing one's name is inherently terrifying, so that one must ask, how can I take up my name in the face of such fear? Why should I even contend with this fear in the first place? Especially if we're thinking about, if I'm taking the level of this fear seriously, it's like this fear is so deep, so transcendent, so difficult to contend with, that at first glance it might even seem to be impossible to overcome. And as a consequence of that, it seems reasonable to me that someone would ask me, or ask you, or ask anybody, like, why should I deal with this? It seems like it's a waste of time. It seems impossible. I don't want to have to deal with these horrible emotions that are going to come. Yeah, and I mean, I think these things are reasonable questions to ask, yeah. But if, for example, Neumann is correct, then that means that basically the fate that you are left to in the face of this decision is either I don't contend with it and I give up my name, or I usurp my name and I become who I'm supposed to be, right? But if you choose to not contend with it, then the thing that you sacrifice is your capacity to, say, be a man or be the person God needs you to be, something like that. You're relegated to fundamentally a type of nihilism, I would say, right? Because the only thing that can give purpose to your life is the thing you give up, because you don't have the courage to contend with the thing that's going to try and take that from you. Because, I mean, nothing that's worth winning, it comes easy. Yeah. Do you have any questions about this? No, okay. All right, cool. So, as always, I like to go and look at the etymological structure of the word to try and understand the ideas that the word constellates and how it emerged. So if you look at what faith is in the Greek text, it's called this word pistis, which etymologically is derived from peto, which has connotations of relying on, trusting, obeying. Although in some dictionaries say that it's active persuasion, other dictionaries say it's to be persuaded by. I think that to be persuaded by probably has better connotations with those other words there. So I would guess that this verb is really to indicate a more passive notion of faith, right? It's something fundamentally submissive to the image of God that's appearing before you. Yeah, but all of these words correspond to a notion of alignment. And I say here, it essentially affectively the way you experience this thing is something like confidence in the acquisition of that which you pursue. And that's to be taken as homologous or effectively the same thing as the experience of faith, right? So when I have confidence that I'm going to be able to acquire the thing that I have in mind as my goal, that's something like faith. The emotional experience I'm having right there is something like faith. Yeah, right. And I say then to have faith or to be faithful, whether or not you have that thing, it's to be judged by the experience of this physiological and psychological criterion, right? So, which is just what I said, right? It's when you have that emotional experience, then you can say, I have faith, or I'm being faithful. And in particular, I'm being faithful to my name. Yeah, and I say specifically an immediate sensation of integration or alignment, right? It's like that thing that happens to you where you can feel your shoulders go back, your spine align, you're like, bring it. Something like that. Or I'm going to conquer you. Something like that. Yeah. Of course, though, that's why I say, but definitely in men up here, is because that instinct to conquest, it's not clear to me that that's correlated with all people in the experience of faith, or if that's a fundamentally masculine experience of faith. Yeah, but maybe I don't think that I've outlined this on camera, but, I would say that the nature of this analysis, as we've talked about before, is coming at it from the masculine point of view, from the patriarchal point of view, because that's better than nothing. So I have to leave that sort of as a question mark right now, is the nature of faith in the context of the feminine. And when I eventually get around to doing analysis of the role of the feminine in the Bible, I probably will revisit this question, or at least I'll try to. Yeah, and Nietzsche has this concept of nobility. He says that the more frequently you experience these affects which correspond to a higher sense of self, the more noble you are in some sense. And so I would say that the more frequently you experience these things, the more faith you have. And so the striving to be more faithful, to be more righteous, is effectively characterized by, well, it can be measured in you directly by introspection, as determined by how often do I feel, I suppose, confident in the ability to acquire the things that I suppose God has ordained for me, something like that. Yeah, but like I mentioned, this Greek form is very passive. And so I wanted to look at the English form. And I was actually kind of surprised by this, because for English, the etymological origins are in the notions of believing and trusting and confidence, which are similar to those up there. But there is also this notion of pledging, which is a fundamentally active action. It's like giving an oath. And so when I saw that was the thing that made me think of that other painting. And that's why I wanted to open this up with Psalm 23, is because I think that this extra piece here really does add a non-trivial component to this notion of faith, especially as how it's used in the Bible. It also appears as the various covenants that the Jewish leaders take, like for example in Abraham and Noah and David, they commit to the thing that God needs them to commit to. And that's just what I say here, is that It indicates a more active aspect. And so another image that I found that I really love is this one.
Oh, wait, before you go.
Oh yeah, sure.
So, can we regard faith as, say, the faculty to perceive potential?
Can we regard faith as the faculty to perceive potential? I don't think that's the whole thing. And the reason why I suppose in its in its passive form, I think that's correct. But what I would say is that it seems to me that a non-trivial component of faith is not just in the perception of that potential, but the commitment to it. In this sense that we've been talking about potential up to this point, like as this thing that we are trying to affectively extremize as humans, or as spiritual beings, I suppose.
But in any case, it's some relation to potential. Right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, but I don't think it's strictly the perception. Yeah, I don't think it's strictly perception, because perception is like, well, I see it, but I don't necessarily need to do anything about it, and I wouldn't regard that individual as being faithful, right? It's something more like I see it and then I commit to it. Yeah, which is exactly why I wanted to show this picture, is because I really think that this picture really shows that, right? You see has his armor laid here before the oath of God. He's looking up at the sky. He's wearing his nice white robes. The architecture is clearly very rigid, very solid, very strong, right? So he's like in the house of God, which, of course, he's in a church, so it is the house of God, right? It's very plain. But it's also very austere, right? And it's like, so he's laying down all of the things that protect him before the altar of God, and pledging himself in such a way as to see that this stuff gets endowed with a sort of righteousness or holiness. That which covers him becomes pure in some sense by virtue of the fact that he's committing to being the thing that he's laid before the altar of God. Right? Yeah, I love this picture. This is a good one. Yes, and he's very stern and serious, because this is something that you don't screw around about, Yeah, and I don't know. One thought that I have here is the reason that the sword is down is because it's to indicate a type of, I suppose, vulnerability or something like that, right? He doesn't have his sword raised towards God as though to challenge him. It's a type of submission.
So you're using this to represent this second definition of faith.
This active one, yeah.
Not the first one.
This notion of giving an oath.
The first one would be more like, I suppose, like how Muslims pray, for instance, with the forehead on the ground, which is more like a submission.
I do think that both components of faith are perceivable in this image, right? Given the fact that, for example, his sword is being down as a type of submission to God, and also the fact that he's laid that which is most precious to him, or what's going to give him greatest protection before the altar, right? He's putting himself in a fundamentally vulnerable position as a consequence of that, right? It's like he's taken off all of his armor. The only way he could be even more vulnerable is if he's naked, right? Given that he's hypothetically a warrior or a knight, right? And if we go back to this one and you compare it here, it's a little bit hard to tell. Well, you can't even really see it because of this, but if I look at this closely, it does look to me like he has some armor on. It looks like he has armor on here and on his legs, right? So this knight is fundamentally in a more vulnerable position. Yeah. And I would say that that does correspond to a type of, like that is trying to indicate the passive component, but I don't think that it's being emphasized, right? I really do, the way that this strikes me is that it tries to wed those two things in an appropriately balanced way. But I would also say that, well, this is just a perhaps subjective intuition on my part, but I do think that there is a non-trivial active component to faith for the Western Christian man. Like I do think that that's part of what it is to be Christian, is to pledge yourself to that thing, right? That's why I define being a Christian as worshiping the truth. I would say that it's fundamentally an active thing to be a Christian. It's like a choice. You see?
But so how is it used in the Bible and the New Testament?
Yeah, we're gonna. I'll get into that actually. I think right now. Good. So there are many examples that we can point to. These were just some of the ones that struck me as the most, I suppose, relevant. I suppose a more systematic analysis might suggest that the balance between this active and passive notion might be different than what I'm putting forward. That being said, it does seem to me that there's at least some evidence to suggest that the one that I'm putting forward is correct. So, the first instance that I want to point to is regarding the faith of the centurion in Matthew 8, 5-13. Jesus is doing his usual stuff, and then a centurion comes up to him, basically. So it says here, when Jesus had entered Capernaum, a centurion came to him, asking for help. "Lord," he said, "my servant lies at home paralyzed and in terrible suffering." Jesus said to him, "I will go and heal him." The centurion replied, "Lord, I do not deserve to have you come under my roof, but just say the word, and my servant will be healed. For I myself am a man under authority, with soldiers under me. I tell this one, 'Go,' and he goes. That one, 'Come,' and he comes. I say to my servant, 'Do this,' and he does it." When Jesus heard this, he was astonished and said to those following him, "I tell you the truth, I have not found anyone in Israel with such great faith. I say to you that many will come from the east and the west and will take their places at the feast with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob in the kingdom of heaven. But the subjects of the kingdom will be thrown outside into the darkness, and there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth." Then Jesus said to the centurion, "Go, it will be done just as you believed it would." And his servant was healed at that very hour. And the reason why this really struck me was because the thing that Christ makes, that the thing that the centurion says that Christ makes him say, that makes Christ say, "Wow, you have such faith," is the centurion's commitment to keeping his structure, keeping his pledges, keeping his oaths, right? Because he says, "I'm a man under authority. I tell this one, 'Go,' I tell this one, 'Come.'" Right? So I tell people what to do, and so I live by this code. Right? And Christ sees in the fact that he's living by that code and his commitment to that code as being indication of his faith. Right? And so it seems to me that this is a very good indicator of the fact that there is this pledging or this active component to this notion of faith. Yeah. Yeah, and then so I wanted to go and look at a couple examples of, because I'm also making this conjecture that it's the antidote to archetypal fear, which incidentally, this particular case also suggests this, but in a more roundabout way, because the centurion's faith negates the death of a component of him if you regard his servant as belonging to him. Right. And so there is a nullification of death by means of faith, which means there's a nullification of this devouring component by means of that faith. And so again, it's sort of a roundabout way of suggesting that it's an antidote to this, or a cure to this fear. I don't like to use the word antidote. It makes me think of 12 Rules for Life and Antidote to Chaos. So but it just keeps coming up in my head, so I can't stop it. So then there's this other example where Jesus calms the storm in 8:23 to 27. It says this. Then he got into the boat, and his disciples followed him. Without warning, a furious storm came up on the lake, so that the waves swept over the boat. But Jesus was sleeping. The disciples went and woke him, saying, "Lord, save us, we're going to drown." Right, so this devouring aspect you can see very strongly in this image. Right. He replied, "You of little faith, why are you so afraid?" And he got up and he rebuked the winds and the waves, and it was completely calm. The men were amazed and asked, "What kind of man is this? Even the winds and the waves obey him." Yeah, I love this story. So of course there's this devouring connotation here, but what we can do is we can actually use some of the evidence from comparative religion to show that this property of storms is fairly typical of the way humans religiously relate to the experience of storms. And so I found there's a thing called the Encyclopedia of Religion, whose chief editor was Mircea Eliade, and that's a great series of books. I really recommend it if you want to get a sense about how religious ideas emerge and so forth. It says, these storm deities are typically male deities, often spouses of the Great Mother, so extensions of her, sort of like her swords or her arms or things like this, right? Yes, and she's the generator of the primordial fear, as we saw earlier, right? Often spouses of the Great Mother and givers of rain, hence prone to, that's a typo, prone to develop into more specialized storm gods and fecundators, right? So there's also some evidence that they tend to be ambivalent in their character, which means that they can be either good or evil, right? So sometimes they come and they bring great life to the earth, which is their nature as fecundators, which just means they have a seminal character, right? But they are still extensions of her, so they aren't proper individuals on their own, right? So they are like her arms or her swords. But because they have an ambivalent character, they can also be great and terrible, which would be, they would be like her army that go in and destroy the village by means of a typhoon or something like that. Yeah. Yeah, and of course, this context clearly shows that the storm is functioning as a generator of this archetypal fear, and Christ as the one who nullifies it. And so if Christ's image in you corresponds to your name, he, admonishes them for having such little faith in their name, such little commitment to their names.
So what's the word for faith that they use there?
Pistis. Yeah.
Is it always that one?
I think so. That's actually a good question. We should double check that. Let me finish this and then we can look. Yeah, and I'm just making this comment that the reason why we go and look at this is because even if this isn't relevant to the notion of Christianity, it is relevant to give us a sense about how we archetypally relate to the idea of storms. So, okay. And then the other example that I wanted to point to was in Matthew 14:25-33. And this is when Christ walks on water. And I think I've read this before here, but of course I can't get away from it. It's one of my favorites too. During the fourth watch of the night, Jesus went out to them, walking on the lake. When the disciples saw him walking on the lake, they were terrified. "It's a ghost," they said, and cried out in fear. But Jesus immediately said to them, "Take courage, it is I, don't be afraid." "Lord, if it's you," Peter replied, "tell me to come to you on the water." "Come," he said. Then Peter got down out of the boat and walked on the water and came toward Jesus. But when he saw the wind, he was afraid, beginning to sink, cried out, "Lord, save me." Immediately, Jesus reached out his hand and caught him. "You of little faith," he said, "why did you doubt?" And when they climbed into the boat, the wind died down. Then those who were in the boat worshipped him, saying, "Truly, you are the Son of God." Right. So, I think that this one does a better job than any other story to indicate that when the fear emerges, it's always at the expense of sacrificing faith, and vice versa, right? Yeah. And also it shows that the name is the thing that mediates those two things. And when you commit to your name, then you will be able to do great things. And the fear will not be able to consume you, right? Because you can literally walk on the water, right? You don't get subsumed by it. You don't get taken over by it, right? But then,
I remember you mentioned that like large bodies of water usually have the interpretation of the unconscious.
yeah, that's right. Yeah, and also the unconscious is typically associated with the Great Mother. Yeah. And so whenever this is why, for example, earlier when I made that, made that reference to Neumann, he said, well, the emergence of self-consciousness necessarily constellates the mother as a negative structure because you're trying to peel away from the unconscious, right? And so you necessarily endow the unconscious with a negative character because it's going to try and, well, basically preserve its character, and you are, imparting some non-trivial, say, entropy into the system, which is going to cause the thing to become more complicated, and so it causes a splitting of a sort. Yeah.
So you're gonna have faith. You use not only you lose your name, but you lose yourself in your unconscious. Is it?
I think that's in the most extreme example that's probably the right interpretation. Yeah. Now, of course, we both understand that when you say if you don't have faith, you lose yourself in your unconscious. We're jumping between the two categories of religion and psychology, right? But you have, if we were to try and be secular about this interpretation, then what that means is if you're insufficiently committed to the purpose that you have been given, by virtue of the nature that you have, then the most extreme example is that you go crazy. You end up in psychosis. Yeah. And that, from my own personal experience, that seems to be a very reasonable thing. I can say that for myself, the worst moments of my life have definitely been characterized by the fact that either I've been avoiding things I know I should be doing because those things are really who I am, or I'm paying the price for the fact that I've been putting that off. So, yeah. And I will say that the moments that I've been on the precipice of insanity have been characterized by that particular property. Yeah. Yeah, and I say there are many other examples. The Bible, the New Testament, all of the Bible's filled with the word faith. We can go and look at it. In principle, it would be smart for us to do that, but there's only so much time in the world. Okay, so then what I wanted to do, so I think that this does a good job of sort of raising up this notion of faith in the context of the religious side of things. So what I wanted to do was sort of tie this into the psychological side of things, and this did make me think of this book that I read, this Fear and Trembling by Kierkegaard, and he introduces this concept of the night of faith, which incidentally I think is probably also what made me think of those images, or made me think to look for those sorts of images. Yeah, and I thought that this passage, there's one other passage that I'll read, but I thought that this passage was particularly poignant. Oh, and I didn't mark the page. That's okay. Kierkegaard says this: the knight of faith is obliged to rely upon himself alone. He feels the pain of not being able to make himself intelligible to others, but he feels no vain desire to guide others. The false knight of faith readily betrays himself by this proficiency in guiding, which he has acquired in an instant. He does not comprehend what it is all about, that if another individual is to take the same path, he must become entirely in the same way the individual and have no need of any man's guidance, least of all the guidance of a man who would obtrude himself. The true knight of faith, if a witness, never a teacher. The true knight of faith, if a witness, maybe it says is, probably. The true knight of faith is a witness, never a teacher, and therein lies his deep humanity, which is worth a good deal more than this silly participation in others' weal and woe, which is honored by the name of sympathy, whereas in fact it is nothing but vanity. Yeah. Yeah, so I've talked about this in the past, but there's this fundamental notion of your name being deeply personal. and only you can know it at the end of the day. And so, playing at your name is, in some sense, forcing your name upon others or something like that, or saying, oh, everybody has the same name. Or, I'll lead you to your name, don't worry, something like that. But the true knight of faith, of course, in some sense, it's as though he's a beacon. And even better, I wouldn't say that he's comfortable, but he accepts the fact that he's fundamentally isolated. Right? And that is the consequence. That's the price that you pay for being an individual, fundamentally. Right? Because, like I just said, no one can know your name to the depths that you would like it to be known except yourself. Yeah. Let me see. I think there was one other passage that I thought was quite good. Yes, here we go. The other passage that I thought was quite good is just at the end. And Kierkegaard says this: faith is the highest passion in a human being. Many in every generation may not come that far, but none comes further. Whether there are also many who do not discover it in our own age, I leave open. I can only refer to my own experience, that of one who makes no secret of the fact that he has far to go, yet without therefore wishing to deceive either himself or what is great by reducing this latter to a triviality, to a children's disease, which one must hope to get over as soon as possible. But life has tasks enough, even for one who fails to come as far as faith. And when he loves these honestly, life won't be a waste either, even if it can never compare with that of those who had a sense of the highest and grasped it. But anyone who comes to faith, whether he be greatly talented or simple-minded, makes no difference, won't remain at a standstill there. Indeed, he would be shocked if anyone said this to him, just as the lover would be indignant if someone said he had come to a standstill in his love, for he would reply, I am by no means standing still in my love, for I have my life in it. And yet he too doesn't come any further, not to anything else, for when he finds that out, he has another explanation. One must go further, one must go further. This need to go on is of ancient standing. Heraclitus the Obscure, who reposited his thoughts in his writings, and his writings in the temple of Diana, for his thoughts had been his armor in life, which he therefore hung up in the temple of the goddess. The obscure Heraclitus has said, one can never walk through the same river twice. The obscure Heraclitus had a disciple who didn't remain standing there, but went further and added, one cannot do it even once. Poor Heraclitus to have such a disciple. This improvement changed the Heraclitean principle into an Eleatic doctrine denying movement, and yet all that disciple wanted was to be a disciple of Heraclitus who went further, not back to what Heraclitus had abandoned. Yeah. Yeah, which, so this picture that I'm trying to paint here of faith as being the oath. If we compare this with what Kierkegaard is saying here and here, it's something like, I have to constantly reaffirm this thing, which is, of course, the existentialist position. And, of course, he's one of the first existentialists, right? But to me, it seems to be true, right? Because if you are judging by this affective experience, that I'm fully integrated, I'm totally myself in the face of God, then it amounts to constant affirmation of that being the truth. A constant pledging of yourself to your name. And, I mean, it's not as though you just sit there and say, I am this, I am this, I am this. Of course, no, you have to live it, right? That is also amounting to commitment to your name. So, yes, this leaves us finally with the question of what is faith psychologically? And so what I say is this. Faith amounts to the conscious oath one takes as an adherence to one's self-image as revealed to him and him alone by God. Right? And so what does that mean? It's something like this thing that I talked about as being the name, in your perception of the name by means of the transcendent, the archetype of the transcendent. And so what faith is the conscious commitment to that thing. So this idea that it consists in something as blindness or negation of evidence is absolutely absurd under this point of view, right? I say here, these two conceptions, that of blindness and negation of evidence, are born of a straw man, which the faculty, which is, in this case, it's the logos, that was differentiated by Christianity, in particular attempts to project upon Christianity in an effort to justify its birth as one without sanctity, since the latter piece is unpalatable to it, as being outside the domain of its apprehension. So all I'm saying here is that the logos, by means of the logos, one understands and perceives his name. But the act of committing to that thing is not an action ascertainable by the logos. You have to rely on a faculty outside of that thing. But that's unpalatable to the logos because the logos needs to be able to just simply differentiate. But this action is something more than mere differentiation. It's a commitment to the thing that you differentiated by means of that faculty. Yeah, but it seems to the logos like, well, I'm blindly throwing myself at something. No, you're not blindly throwing yourself at something. You just did all of the work to show that this thing exists. So maybe it's something you should use, right? Maybe it's something you should take up. Yes, but I do say that the improper application of faith does, in other words, an improper interpretation of the meaning of faith, does amount to a perpetuation of a psychic frame that's intolerable today and clashes with the data Christianity offers up. In other words, this blindness, this foolishness, this negation of evidence, as being interpreted as faith, does occur if one naively interprets this notion of faith. Yeah, and I thought Jung had a particularly useful quote here. He says this: religious faith, which is this false type of faith under my framework, on the other hand, refuses to give up its pre-critical Weltanschauung, that's just worldview basically. In contradiction to the saying of Christ, the faithful try to remain children instead of becoming as children. Right? So it's like an excuse to behave as an infant or immaturely. Right? It's something like an excuse one would use in order to prevent having to contend with the archetypal fear that you feel at the beginning. And so it's not real faith. Yeah, and I say here, this is the limit, this limit that Jung refers to here, is the limit in which the materialist critique obtains validity. The hypothesis that this limit is immediately achieved, however, upon the introduction of the idea of faith is obviously absurd. I just made a comment on why that's true. Yeah, and so then I say here, okay, the translation of all this junk, not junk, well, whatever. All of these ideas, synthesizing all of these ideas into something that's psychologically coherent is this. Faith is the conscious adherence to the inner image of the archetype of the self, which is your name, as indicated by the image of the archetype of the transcendent, which is the thing that does the revealing to you, which is mediated by the logos. It's the commitment to one's purpose above all else. That is, it's the willful adoption and engagement of one's God-given name at every moment of his life. Yeah.